Welcome back, gents, to Guy Shrink, the podcast where we talk about what keeps a guy awake at night, or sometimes we talk about what ought to keep a guy awake at night. We talked about guys in relationships, guys in their families, why a guy should do philosophy. Got one out on working. How do you deal with porn in your life if you're struggling with that? What happens when the doctor gives you a diagnosis that's not so good? How about when a friend fires you? We've talked about all that kind of stuff in the past. And today we got another special guest. We're going to talk about why a guy should attend the symphony. And my guest today is a really good friend, Zak Vassar, who's the CEO of the Toledo Symphony Orchestra, which is probably one of the best orchestras in the country. So, Zak, welcome to Guy Shrink.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be on.
Thanks. Well, as I've talked to you before and you're familiar with, we always begin with the question, what's a guy like you? What keeps a guy like you awake at night?
This question has been keeping me awake at night. I think everybody has similar anxieties that wake them up at 2 a.m. And, I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't the email that I didn't respond to or some other contact that I hadn't made. But, I do, from a professional standpoint, try to think about ways that we can kind of get people to dig into the real thing, to feel something. And I worry that a lot of times that our world has become really noisy, and that our addiction to kind of scroll satisfaction in life through scrolling through Facebook or Instagram is the best that we can do. It means that we're getting farther away from what's real and what's passionate. And I think in that way we need a real reality check. So that does keep me awake at night.
Oh, isn't that, don't we call it doom scrolling? Isn't that?
It's funny. I was thinking about that. I never heard this idea about scrolling until the pandemic. And then there were all these horrible headlines and people started talking about doom scrolling. And I said, oh, there's a name for that thing that I've been doing so much lately.
I've been doing, yeah, I love that.
Yeah. But yeah, scrolling. I feel like we just, we spend a lot of time wasting time on social media or the internet, and it's not real. It doesn't give us any greatness to our day. It doesn't give us any richness, and it doesn't really teach us anything. I guess it can teach you facts, but it doesn't give you depth. And I just feel like, that the world that we should be spending more time getting depth from is something that's that allows us to be really present, and kind of invites us to live in an unfiltered way. And I think the arts really are a solid conduit to that. So as much as it keeps me up at night because I'm trying to find ways to bring more people to it, I stay up at night because I'm afraid people aren't called to it as much as they used to be.
Well, Zak, that's a great segue for the topic that I want to talk about, why a guy should attend the symphony. And you're the CEO of the Toledo Symphony. And how did you get into that job?
Oh, I just keep coming to work and they keep paying me. So
okay, that's another good philosophy on what a guy should do. Go to work.
Yeah. Well, this is a lifelong wish and dream. And if you would have asked me in high school what I wanted to do, or even when I was, in grade school, I would say I wanted to work at a symphony. And in my childhood, I always recognized that I didn't have the musical aptitude or talent to really go there and do that. So I tried to find ways to get to the other side, which is the administrative side. And I interned with the Toledo Symphony when I was in high school and a little bit when I was in college, and really figured that I wanted to have a very carefully architectured 15-year voyage in orchestras, large, medium, and small, with the goal of coming back to the Toledo Symphony when I was in my late 30s. And, best laid plans never turn out the way that you hope. But I was able to still find my way to my dream job. I was 38, so I was kind of right on time. And, you talk about imposter syndrome. There was a horrible feeling that I was getting everything I ever wanted, but I didn't know if I actually deserved any of it. So this is 9 years in. So I think we've done a lot, and we've done a lot that I'm really proud of. But my gosh, I get to work with people who are creative, and they focus on building harmony and community every day. And I couldn't be happier.
That's remarkable. I love the fact that you, at an early age, when you were a teenager and in high school, you already had an idea. What do I really want to do with my life?
Yeah.
I know guys that are 40 and still haven't figured that out.
I know people in their 60s who are still
Well,
listening,
that's
right?
true too.
Well, and look, I mean, I haven't figured everything out, but I think that when I was really young, music spoke to me in a very special way, and it gave me the opportunity to just deeply engage in something that mattered incredibly to me, and it was a no-brainer. I wanted to surround myself with it, and even though I ended up having a wonderful career in consulting, and I got to work with great clients and travel the world, I still was populating my days and my weekends with music and attending live performances. So that's always been really important to me. And, I think it's given me a lot of balance. And maybe, who knows, I wouldn't have been able to reach out and grab the ring and enjoy this job if it weren't for that perspective.
Okay. Okay. Well, Zach, you said just a tremendous amount of stuff here. Let's kind of break it down a little bit. Why should a guy attend the symphony? And what are some ideas about why is symphony so important? Why is music and symphonic music in particular so important?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of ways you can answer that, right? I think, there are people who probably have certain preconceptions about what it means to go to the symphony or what it means to get involved in classical music. And, like it or not, it's always been an art form that has been associated with older clientele. So, unless we're in the day where Beethoven is writing in its current music, this has always been an art form. But because it's an art form, that means that we have to approach it not like what you're going to listen to on your commute necessarily to get from point A to point B, but to look at it like art that you're going to make an active choice to surround yourself with. And people spend a lot of time figuring out what the background of their computer could look like or what their phone case should look like.
Right.
We think about the way we dress and the car we drive, and it all expands our outward perceptions. But these are all artistic choices. So isn't it great that we can think about art in the same way, whether it's visual art or performance art, what I call live art? We need to find ways to harness an artistic entertainment because it does challenge our perspectives. It helps us to hear what somebody is feeling based on what surrounds them, and that could be a current time, that could be a time long ago. And much like looking at a painting, you're seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. In music, particularly classical music, you're hearing the world through somebody else's ears, emotions, experiences, passions, fears. And that can really open up your mind to something larger. But I'm going to just go back and answer a different question. Why do you need to go to the symphony? Why should a guy go to the symphony? It gets you out of your routine, and it can truly skip your record and help you to do something that develops your authenticity, that develops your willingness to consider other people's opinions and traditions and values. And we can dive into that, but the more we go into that digital world where we scroll until the end of time, we lose presence and we lose the ability to really be awakening. So I think when you go to a concert and the light dims and the orchestra tunes, you're not looking at your phone. You're going to sit down for 90 minutes and you're going to experience something, and you're going to make yourself open to that and tap into this kind of primal dialogue. And we as guys don't do that. We don't do that very well because, we're constantly faced with responsibilities and deadlines and expectations, and that creates anxieties, and we feel like we feel frozen. So what's a better way to thaw than to tap into that primal part of your emotions and your perceptions? So I think it's a very important tool for guys to go out and do.
Well, when I go to the symphony, when my wife and I go to the symphony, you talked about anxiety. Instead of having anxiety, I have anticipation. And so I'm sitting in a seat, and I might look at the program, and I might know something a little bit about what's being played, but the anticipation that's there. And just to quote a couple of things that you said earlier, as we met earlier over coffee, you talked about it gives us a space to feel deeply, think differently, and reconnect. And that's what I anticipate, that less about looking at because the phone is anxiety in the phone. It just comes with that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something where, isn't it great that you can go to a concert and people much smarter than you or me have put thought into what is going to create a wonderful meal. When you have
Hmm.
an appetizer, you have a main course, and you have a dessert. And these things are not going to be, meat and more meat. You're going to have different flavors, different nationalities on the program. And as a sort of curated whole, it is entertaining. And it's also entertaining because you got to see these things in a particular order, and you can react to them in a special way. So, like, you talk about, how do you grow? How do you become a more adaptable leader or authentic leader? It's sitting back, taking things in, reacting to it in a very careful way, responding to it, and then letting it change you.
You talked about earlier about that primal part
Yeah.
in us and guys. So could you expand on that a little bit about when you talk about primal part? What are some of the ideas that you have in mind about that you get energized in the symphony? That primal part of us as guys can get energized in listening to the music.
Well, it's visceral. When you're sitting down to a concert, you can't help but recognize that it's happening right in front of you, and it's happening in real time. So, Bill, when you and I talked about this over coffee, we compared live art to visual art, and visual art doesn't change. The Monet on the wall is going to be the same Monet, and you can come back to that Monet in different days or different months or different years, and maybe even different phases of your life, and look at the same swirls of paint in the same frame. Those don't change. Your reaction to it might change because you are the one who has changed, but the paint is static and it stays the same. Live art, what we do, is something that is always being recreated, and that gives it this visceral, sort of primal recreation thing. You can go see the same program by the same symphony on different nights, and it's going to be different. You can go see that same piece of music in different cities by different symphonies, and it's going to be different. And you can listen to recordings from 60 years ago and listen to recordings that were made today, and those are also going to be different. So, this is an art form that is intentionally meant to be revisited, recreated, and responded to. And there's something about that energy that is palpable. So, when we think about visual art, it's anesthetic to that, because if we were going to recreate visual art, we would call that a forgery or a hoax. It's not the same, right? We go and recreate Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and it becomes part of our experience. It becomes modern. It becomes relevant because it's being made right now
Yeah,
in front of us.
yeah.
And every one of those trumpet players and horn players could move their instrument away from their mouth. All of the strings players could move the bows off their instrument, and it would be silent because it's being performed right in front of you. And it
Yes.
sounds like the most glorious thing you've ever seen. And there's no accident that this music has persisted for hundreds of years. There's something gloriously evocative and romantic and historic about it.
Yeah. The first time I heard Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, I think I was in eighth grade, maybe, whatever. We were at a band concert, something I don't remember. And of course, Shot from Guns or the Quaker Oats commercial is what I remember when he basically saying that. But it was a visceral moment. I remember to this day. And every time I hear that, which I've heard that forever, over forever, and the same visceral feelings come on me that I had way back when I was in eighth grade for the first time, hearing that for the very first time.
But there's something about live music that does that. I have a couple memories that come to mind. I used to live in Boston, and in Boston there are many orchestras. It seems like you have to work really hard not to find an orchestra around the corner. But I took a group of colleagues to the symphony because I was really into the symphony, and I would always invite people to come with me, and sometimes they would and sometimes they wouldn't. And so a small group of 4 or 5 colleagues finally said, like, let's go as a group. We'd love to see it. We don't want to try it on our own. Be our tour guide. And I don't think any of them had ever really been to a concert. And at the end of the performance, everybody stood up. I mean, the idea of a standing ovation being something that you're part of, you can't sit still. You are on your feet because it has to come up and through you and out your mouth and clapping. everyone stood up clapping, and one of the guys I was with turned to me and said, I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, I had no idea how much I needed that. And that stuck with me because, for that guy, we worked in heavy marketing analytics at the time. The arts were hitting him in a way that a spreadsheet or a headline on a PowerPoint slide can't, because it hit him where he was where he was living and in his moment of life in a very special way. So that visceral thing, it's we are predisposed as humans to respond to this stuff, and they have great studies where they set up nodes and monitors to musicians, and they monitor what's going on in the brain as the musician is playing a piece of classical music in an orchestra. And parts of the brain light up in that don't light up in any other daily activity. And, you just think about something as crazy as, sitting down and maybe playing an instrument yourself, playing a piano yourself, and the amount of parts of your mind and body that have to work in coordination. You're listening to what you're playing. Your hands are moving or playing in a different way. Your eyes are reading music, kind of interpreting a language on the fly, and maybe your feet are operating a pedal. Like it's a whole body thing, and listening to it isn't much different because we're designed to respond to this stuff.
Well, that's a lot different than doom scrolling. That's for sure.
I got another one for you. There's this other thing about after the concert, and after I go to a rehearsal or even a concert, sometimes it's so great and grand and moving that when I get back in the car, the first thing I have to do is turn off the radio. And that's very rare for me. I used to marvel that my dad could drive for hours in silence. I can't do that. But there's often the sense of the quiet ride home. And it's just that point where you've had so much input that, your guy brain just needs to reflect. And you're sitting in the moment that you just experienced, and it's still playing back to you, and you're still coming down from it, and you're still kind of responding to it in a different way. And you compare that to chilling with Netflix. It's just like, gosh, you can't say that you're not carrying something bigger and deeper. And honestly, something that's we live in such a noisy world that, something like a live performance can demand you to turn to silence. That is so powerful.
Yes, absolutely. There was a time in my life when, for about 25 years, every Sunday morning, I would play Rachmaninoff's Vespers.
Yeah.
I'm just carried away, but it was definitely a visceral experience.
Why that piece for you?
I remember hearing it with a friend. We were talking about something, and I really I've always enjoyed Russian music for what was probably my Slavic roots coming out here, and I enjoy listening to Rachmaninoff, and that piece,
especially when you say it that way. Yeah. I could listen to you say that. I could hear it all day.
Rachmaninoff. It was just a visceral experience. It was like, wow. It was just like, wow. That's the only word I could say right now. And so I had several renditions of it. Over the years, bought several renditions and would listen to them. And there's just something there that does something for me. It's beyond words for me, but it's definitely a visceral experience. And if I'm working here in my office, and maybe I'm working on a kind of a long-term project about something, I will put that on to this day, just to listen to those first several of those. And given the history of who Mr. Rachmaninoff was and what he had to put up with in his life, and just the Russian world back in those days, and the oppression, and this was a protest song in a way. Mm-hmm. God is great, greater than Stalin ever will be. And so I think that's what it does. It brings those ideas back to me. So,
and for those who might be listening and don't know this work, it's a entirely a cappella masterpiece. So there are no instruments; it's all choral music. And the Vespers were really the music that the church would use for the all-night vigil. So, you have to kind of think that this is nocturne, this is night music, this is something kind of not meant to lull you to sleep, but also not that far from a lullaby.
Yes.
And when you have, and I don't think they're not singing in English. Are they singing in Russian?
Yeah, it's Slavonic. It's Slavonic.
So you're listening to a language that is not always associated with the mellifluous sounds of Italian or French. They're singing in what is sometimes a very guttural language, and it sounds just like the voices of heaven. And the whole piece, I mean, it fits on a CD. I'm showing my age a little bit. It fits on an album, but it's 65 minutes of music, and it's just radiant. And it feels like one of those things where you can kind of almost imagine in the Russian countryside, the snow-swept landscape, and you can hear the music coming through the church windows. And then you go into the church, and it's warm and pregnant with meaning. And it's music that was meant to move you and to evoke that sort of
yes,
creative sensibility.
Yes.
But Rachmaninoff could do that. And it's interesting to listen to that music and realize, holy cow, this is written in the 20th century when music was sounding very different. I mean, we were just at that point a decade or two away from Rock Around the Clock.
Yeah.
So
that's correct. That's correct. But that transporting you into the ethereal and the eternal was what that was about. And of course, the context of a Russian Orthodox church is there are no blank spaces anywhere. Everything is covered with icons. And the idea is to transport you into a heavenly vision. It's to experience eternity here. And that music does that. And when you said all night vigil, that literally it's all night. Pack a lunch, because it's you're going to be there for a while. Yeah. And so, that just music, it speaks to me in ways, again, it's just beyond words sometimes. And sometimes I'll find myself crying when I'm listening to this. And I know, what's all that about? But something has touched me in such a way. And you don't get that doom scrolling.
You don't, because that as I said, that these composers are reacting to something in their life, and it could be their sadness, it could be their triumph. Rachmaninoff was an interesting fellow because he emigrated to America. So I promise I'm not going into a music history lesson here, but he emigrated to America, and he had a truly celebrity life. He died in Beverly Hills, and he wrote music that sounded like an older generation of music. So he's writing alongside people like Stravinsky, who was a modernist, and even Ravel, who was playing with harmony and Debussy in a very different way. He's writing in the New World, and he's writing music that sounds very much like a generation ago, and he was writing music that is poignantly nostalgic. And you can listen to most music by Rachmaninoff, and it's very fiery and melodic in the loud passages, but it's always the slow movements where you feel that nostalgic for a Russian homeland.
Yes.
That doesn't exist anymore. And, I think put a set of headphones on any human and play one of these moments, whether it's from the Vespers or the slow movement from the second piano concerto or the slow movement from the second symphony, and you can't help but respond to it. And it ends up being one of these truly, like, we are all together in this rat race.
Yes, that's correct.
Because we can all say, I don't know who wrote this, but I can sense what he was feeling.
Yes.
And, say what you want about Taylor Swift or Katy Perry or the pop icon of the day, that authenticity isn't there, because those are wonderful and entertaining pieces of music, but they're meant to be entertaining, full stop. When these composers are spending months and years writing a composition, they're pouring their heart and soul into it because it's meant to be an artistic experience and expression. Yeah. So Rachmaninoff was giving so much of himself because he missed his homeland. And, we all kind of miss our homeland in a different way. And the challenge for us guys is sometimes, we can't go back. We might do things or say things that prevent us because we're too proud to go back and confront something. We might not keep the relationship with our families that we want, so we can't go back. And sometimes we have these sort of halcyon memories of how much easier things used to be, and we can't go back to those either. So, whatever the expression or the experience, every one of us has some sense of wanting to go back in nostalgia for a different time, and Rachmaninoff, for some reason, just bottles that.
Yeah, yes, for sure. Now, we're verging on a really important point that you made in our conversation. I want to make sure we talk about it because I thought it was a real piece of brilliance here. Going back to the fellow that was with you in Boston, and he turns to you and says, "I really needed that." And you remarked to me as we were talking earlier about it's not about entertainment; it's about antidote. And would you say a more about that idea that symphonic music is less about entertainment, it's there, but more about antidote, and what you had in mind with that?
Yeah, I remember this is something that I was thinking about on a long drive. So you talk about driving at nighttime. My family and I were coming back from spring break, and I was somewhere in Kentucky, I think, and driving up the highway, and this idea of the antidote kind of hit me, and it's that artistic experiences or expression become really important, especially for, I think, guys in a particular season of their life, because they pull us out, and they kind of smack us in the face and help us to understand the parts that we're missing, and it pulls us away from our anxieties or the roles that we think we're supposed to play, and it can fill in the gaps that we are spending all of our time hunting to repair or expand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really what good art does is it helps you to respond to excellence and elegance in a different way. But the farther we get into that doom scrolling world, and the farther we get toward paying the bills and keeping our email box at zero, and trying to keep your boss happy.
There's a Dr. Phil question about that. So how's that working for you?
Yeah, right. We need this antidote, because honestly, I really feel like if you open yourself to an artistic expression, whether it's visual art or live art, it will open your mind to something that is exactly what you're looking for, exactly what you need. There's a fellow who comes to our concerts, and he brings a pad of paper and a pen, and he's a very successful businessman, and he goes to the concert. He sits in the same seat every concert, and he starts writing. And it's not right away, but some point between minute number 2 and the finale, he will reach in his jacket pocket and pull out his pad and his pen, and he'll start writing. And people often wonder if he's the newspaper critic, and I'll gladly say, I wish we had a newspaper critic. We don't have those anymore. But if you ask him, what is he doing? He said, gosh, I come to the concert, and it's something about where my head goes. My mind opens up, and I finally can think the things that I can't get to in the office because I have so many distractions. And for this man, he does his best thinking in the concert hall.
I can agree with that. Yeah.
He scribbles stuff down because he's tapping into the antidote to all the stuff that doesn't actually lead to productivity. And so the concert experience pulls him out of the grind, and it puts him in touch with stuff that really matters. And it makes him present. And who among us can find that presence and says, gosh, I don't need any of this. I mean, it's like when was the last time you woke up and said, man, I wish I didn't get so much sleep last night, or gosh, I wish I had more to drink last night. These things that we can tap into and be present usually are very rewarding. And that's why I feel like the artistic experience as an antidote is important. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, just using the word important, I'm thinking about the gentleman that takes notes at the symphony. His world is immersed in urgency. Like all of our worlds are immersed. We respond to the urgent, and that's what the phone does. That's what the email does. It's yelling and screaming, hey, pay attention to me. And yet nothing of substance gets done in urgency. It's only when we attend to important things, and that's why we have to isolate ourselves, sequester ourselves. What he's doing that mentally at the symphony, that's when we can do the important things. Things move when we're working with importance, not not urgency.
It's true. It's very true. And yeah, I used to have an office across from the art museum, and I would get bogged down in a report or a project or a spreadsheet, and I would get up, I'd walk away from my desk, and I would walk across the street to the art museum. And we're fortunate in Toledo, Ohio, to have a world-class top 10 art museum, and it happens to be free to the public. So you literally have no barrier to entry. And gosh, a 20-minute walk through a gallery, sometimes looking at a painting that I've walked by a million times and zeroing in on it, and maybe it's something in the corner that catches my attention. That just is such a refreshing mind heal, that reality check. You're checking in with something that's real, that I can go back and then suddenly have a totally different perspective to answering whatever challenge was dragging me down at the office. And I often wonder, how much longer would I have wasted and whittled away my energy and probably not gotten to this outcome or this conclusion. So, we as guys have a really tough time pulling away. We get hyper-fixated and goal-oriented. But, gosh, I can't imagine where I would be in my life or my family or my career if it weren't for those opportunities to back away, go have an artistic experience, feed on that antidote, and then come back and make up for a ton of lost yardage.
Yes. So you think that attending to antidotes is a leadership skill that guys could craft and work on?
Yeah. Yes. Period. Full stop. Yes. But think of what we have to do as leaders. Oftentimes we're trying to build consensus or identify the trajectory or look at a point on the horizon and just point at it and say, that's where we're going today. You need to have so many tools very sharp to do that well. And, if you think about it from a big picture standpoint, you need to be able to listen. You need to be able to keep your eyes on several variables, some of which could be a big problem, some of which could be, rancor in the ranks or disenfranchisement across your team. You have to look at people who are coming to whatever the business challenge might be or whatever the group might be tackling, with different prerogatives, different experiences, different stories. And you need to be able to adapt all of their different starting lines to whatever you're moving them forward to, right? And that just means that you have to be exceedingly adaptive and creative and innovative to manage people and lead them toward a conclusion. I would hazard that all of the things we've been talking about today artistically predispose you to doing that very well.
Yes.
Because you're listening through somebody's ears, as we talked about earlier. You're seeing through somebody's eyes. You're thinking about a world a little bit differently than you or I might, with our own kind of native experiences, biases, or whatever. We all bring something a little bit different to the table. But it's that emotional intelligence that exposure to the arts can put you into, that can make you a really fine leader and give you a lot of those sharp tools that you might not be able to get otherwise. Going into the pandemic, I found it very interesting at how quickly humanity reversed to artistic experience. And it was funny because it was like the one time we couldn't do it. So what do you do as a thought experiment to a bunch of people who have suddenly found themselves with a lot of anxiety and a lot of time on their hands? They doom scroll. We've already addressed that. But many people found themselves reading more books than they had ever read. Libraries were doing curbside delivery of library books. People were taking virtual tours of art museums that were far away because that was something that was missing from their daily experience and maybe something they always wanted to get around to. The streaming of classical music hit an all-time high. It literally was off the charts. And it wasn't just people who were more prone to come down with COVID. It wasn't just people who like this stuff anyway. There was a lot of first-time exploration, trial, younger generations who were focusing on these things because they needed that sort of comfort. They needed that sense of beauty. And I was really hopeful. I think at that point in our world, there's a lot of scary stuff out there, but we needed art and beauty more than we ever had. And going back to what keeps me up at night, when we turn, the life back on, I'm a little disappointed that we haven't held on more dearly to some of those things that we discovered in that time.
Well, one thing that certainly happened during COVID is there was less urgency.
Yeah.
Things were shut down. And so there was a time to reflect and to maybe attend to those important things. Just a quick thing about leadership skills is you were talking about the arts, music being one of those the things. I was thinking about Winston Churchill, talk about a man that had to deal with urgency like crazy. It developed painting more than just a pastime. It was therapy for him, but it was art. He had to do art to relieve his existential angst. And he became a very fine painter. Not that we should take up painting, but the idea of connecting with art as a way to be an antidote to the urgencies that can overtake life.
I completely agree. And you give me two things to offer here. One is this idea of responding versus reacting. So you and I have talked about this a lot. The urgent items and the frantic things that you don't see coming put us guys into a very reactive mode when we need to respond, and usually instead. But art is something that inherently we respond to, and often it's with great appreciation and beauty. So when Winston Churchill goes to start painting, he's getting away from the reactive, and he's putting something onto canvas that is an artistic response, right?
I agree with that.
So, yeah. The other thing is, we have a music school here at the Symphony, and we have a lot of, adorable little children who come in to take violin lessons or cello lessons or piano lessons or saxophone lessons. And it amazes me because these kids are trying to do something that's very difficult and that they're not good at. I mean, nobody just picks up a violin unless you're a prodigy and just plays it beautifully. Most of the time it sounds something between, rubbing sandpaper on a chalkboard or, stepping on the family cat. But from those rough beginnings forms talent, technique, and something that sounds really beautiful, right? Kids can take that exploration of what's hard and adapt to it very quickly. Adults forget to do that. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, if you look at our enrollment, it's 95% kids, 18 and younger. And I'd probably hazard it's probably 80% 12 and under. And, what does it say about our plasticity as children to try something and fail and figure out how to do it better? That intellectual curiosity that's so real and vibrant at a young age, that by the time we're in our 30s or 40s, our plasticity is not even available to something like that. And the fear of trying something and failing is so humiliating that we won't even put ourselves out there to do it.
Mm-hmm. That's correct, Zach.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So Winston Churchill is staring at a blank canvas, is confronted all of the urgent things that he had to react to, and he's swirling different colors together, and he's making something beautiful, and he's putting himself out there, and he's creating an artistic reaction.
I agree. Well, Zach, before we wrap up completely, I do want to ask you, what guy goes to symphony? Why a guy should go to symphony? What might be a couple of composers that might be worth listening to that you found it in your life and that's been helpful for you?
Well, thanks for asking me a tough question as we're wrapping up, quote unquote. Look, there's kind of three composers that I would throw out there, and probably three pieces that I would say we should investigate here. And you'll be happy to know that two of them are Russian, so you'll be happy.
Good feature.
So these would be in no particular order: Beethoven's Ninth, Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, and Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, which is also known as the Pathétique. And these are masterpieces. So you wait along, 4 or 5 years, most symphonies, including ours, will play them. We're playing Tchaikovsky 6 next year. We played Beethoven 9 this year, and we played Shostakovich 5 last year. So, I mean, these are kind of frequent plays, greatest hits, air quotes.
Yeah. Great music. Yeah.
In terms of what they offer, I can give you just why I think they're important to investigate, particularly from the anxious guy seat. Beethoven's Ninth This is basically what I would call deaf man writes the greatest anthem to joy that the world has ever heard. Like, just think about that for a second. And it's music that everybody who hears it understands as literally the world anthem. The anthem of the entire European Union is Beethoven's Ode to Joy, which comes at the end of the Ninth Symphony. And that has a populist appeal because it's music that really believes in the human spirit, even when the odds are stacked against you. So it has a very strong triumph over struggle narrative. And, I think about, guys who are pushing through professional challenges and plateaus, personal and otherwise. Beethoven 9 is really one of those works that is pure feel. And if you sit back and feel it, which I encourage everybody to do, remind yourself at many intervals that he was completely deaf when he wrote it. And here it is exploding with optimism, unity, resilience. And it really reminds us that our limitations don't define us, okay? It's music that even when I was a kid, I would listen to it and I would limit how often I would listen to the whole symphony. Now, this shows what kind of nerd I was. My parents would go out at night. Instead of calling my friends over and throwing a party, I would put on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and sit on the floor of our den and take 80 minutes, because that's how long the symphony is, and listen to it. And by the end of it, I felt like I had finished a marathon. My palms would be sweaty. I would be exhausted. And this music is very effective because of that. And when you listen to it for the first time, it conjures up just feelings that we all hold very dear. The first time you hold your kid, the first time you kiss your wife. There are moments where we channel everything that we've been through into a moment that we'll never forget. And this symphony is that for Beethoven. And it's just revolutionary because of it. Here I am getting choked up thinking about Beethoven's Ninth, Bill.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Zach. It's given what you just said about Beethoven's, who he was as a person, and what came out of that experience of being a man, that piece of music. It's everything you said about it is absolutely true. Yeah.
Do you want me to go into the other two, or should we leave it there?
Well, I want to hear more about the Russians.
Yeah, I figured you would. That's why I saved them for the end.
Yeah, right. Saved for the last. Okay.
All right, so Shostakovich and Tchaikovsky, both Russians. So let's start with Shostakovich. This is music of the 20th century, and it was written as a response to Stalin and what he was doing politically, but also what he was doing artistically. So to be a composer in Russia at that time meant that you had to basically play from the playbook, compose music that would be celebrating the Russian leaders of the time. So I really say that Shostakovich 5 is a symphony that is smiling through clenched teeth. It's something that is bold, and it's certainly defiant, because he basically hides codes in the music to tell everybody in the audience what they want to hear, but then to tell everybody in the politics what they think they are getting. So it's aching, and it says everything that can't be said out loud. So, this appeals to the guy's psyche in some wonderful ways, because it's full of huge amounts of unspoken tension. It's a little mysterious, and, it's a masterclass in saying what you really mean and not saying it directly. So, if you think about us guys, if you understand what it means to read the room, to manage pressure, or maybe even wear a mask to get through a day, this is that symphony. Okay, and it's very complicated, and
indeed it is.
he wrote music that sounded like the great celebration of everything Russia, but in the inner moments he had themes that were actually Russian folk songs. Again, that idea of nostalgia going back, because we all were raised on different folk traditions wherever we were born, or whoever raised us. We had, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and Frere Jacques and things like that when we hear those things hidden in music, it snaps us back to a different time. And Shostakovich did this very well, because particularly in the slow movement of that symphony, he created something that was deeply mournful and literally had Russians crying in the premiere because they knew that this music was written for all of the forgotten folks
Yes.
who were struggling at that time.
Yes.
And he wrote it in a way that Stalin thought, finally, our buddy Dmitri wrote the kind of music we've been asking him to. So he, as I said, he said everything that he couldn't say out loud in the music. But it's a good lesson, I think, for guys, because it's a good thing to think about if you've ever had to smile through adversity or stress, to go put yourself out on the line and lead when you weren't really feeling ready to do it, or to find, something that feels true in a world that wants you to be somebody else. This is that music. And I feel like for a guy, we're all looking for this sometime. So it's a wonderful and rewarding
Absolutely
thing.
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
See, I didn't cry on that one. Tchaikovsky 6, the Pathétique Symphony. This is the last symphony, the last work of music that Tchaikovsky wrote. And I kind of characterize this as the final breath. It's the final breath in musical form. And it's very tender music, but it's also really broken music. This is a shattered man, and it's extraordinarily honest. And because of that honesty, it is so beautiful. It's music that literally doesn't ask for applause. He takes what would be the finale and he throws that in as the third movement. And that's usually the thing that everybody starts applauding if they don't know the work. They get through the first movement, sounds great. Second movement sounds great. Third movement sounds like that's a finale. Yahoo! Standing ovation. But then comes the surprise. Tchaikovsky puts as the fourth and last movement one of the most aching, gorgeous, and real expressions of music that I can imagine. And this is all about feeling, the pure feel that I talked about in Beethoven. This is all about feeling, and it's not a narrative that's pretending or trying to be heroic. It's vulnerable, it's heartache, and it's beauty wrapped into this symphony. And this to me feels like if you've ever been told just tough it out or be a man or get through, leave your emotions at the door. This is a piece of music that really kind of reminds you that feeling deeply is or can be a real strength, and that honesty and vulnerability is not something to run away from. So if you've wrestled ever with grief or identity, or trying to figure out what your legacy is going to be, this is something that shows that real courage is not in suppressing your emotion, but embracing it and really doing that fully. And I hate to blow the ending here, but he did commit suicide shortly after this music was written. So it's really the last whispers of a truly fine genius who is just tortured. And I don't encourage anybody to take those actions. We have too much love around us, but you can't help listen to this music and feel that it's not a cry for help. It's just it's a final breath, like I said, set to music.
Yeah. Zach, it's wonderful. Everything you said today has just been marvelous and so helpful about why a guy should attend the symphony. But I just have one more little thing here. But try to close every program with this. So you and I get on an elevator, and we've got a few seconds to get down from the top floor to the bottom floor, and your elevator speech. So what's a final thought you want to leave with our listeners about why a guy should attend the symphony?
Well, if you want a front row seat, I'll put this in the audience perspective. If you want a front row seat to really understanding what discipline and honesty, passion and beauty look like, go to a concert, make yourself open to it. You are going to walk out. You're going to walk out sharper. Those tools will be sharper. You're going to walk out more grounded, and maybe even inspired to think more strategically or innovatively than you would otherwise. And you're definitely going to feel a little more in tune with yourself. And that's why I go, and I hope more guys do.
Yeah. Thanks, Zach. Thanks very much. We've been speaking with Zak Vassar, who's the CEO of the Toledo Symphony Orchestra, and we've been talking for a great afternoon here on why a guy should attend the symphony. And you've been listening to Guy Shrink, the podcast where we talk about what keeps a guy awake at night. I'm Bill Rothman, the host here. And if you've got some ideas about what we could talk about in the future, drop me a line at bill@guyshrink.com. And if you've enjoyed this, you can sign up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on YouTube as well. So thanks for listening. And until the next time, this is Bill signing off.